Well, we're here gathered at the end of the first day of very successful and hopefully productive Athletik-Konferenz. I have a distinguished panel here of experts both in strength and conditioning, medicine as well, but obviously on using biological data with Omegawave on training athletes. The specific reason why I wanted to have you guys here is one of the most common topics that comes up from our users across the globe is, okay, I see, hey, Omegawave, I see my athlete having, for example, low DC potential or very high parasympathetic tone, or my MRI and my aerobic index are low chronically. What do I do? What can I do? What kind of interventions can I apply in order to help my athlete get out of these conditions? Now, if we start with Kornelius, based on your experience and knowledge, how would you orientate that kind of a user who asks these type of questions?
At first, I want to understand the athlete. So what happened in the exercise before, the training before? What is the context of the athlete? So it's family. Maybe it's a family problem. Maybe it's a financial problem that causes the problem, or it's really the training. Yeah. So I at first have to distinguish these problems, and then I can manage something.
First of all, I completely agree with Kornelius. It depends on the athlete, on the biochemistry and the genetic makeup of the athlete. That's number one. It's like with foods. One athlete's superfood is the other athlete's poison. And we get the same food, but it might not work out. In case of recovery, if you measure recovery, DC potential or HRV or any other factor, it's a little bit... is the potential too high or too low. There's different things there. There's a sympathetic tone or high parasympathetic tone need a different approach. That's number one. And then even before the Omegawave, before we could measure recovery, basically we already used the system. Okay, what can we do with nutrition? What can we do with exercise? What can we do with more, say, exotic things like sound or acupuncture, or say the alternative or complementary medicine? And then you have a whole list of basically possible interventions for each situation: DC potential too high, DC potential too low. So it's a matter of research that has been done to see which application works on HRV, brings the HRV up or down. That's already done. And then you have to figure out yourself a lot of things and just try things if they work. And then in cooperation with Kornelius and with Val, we try different things. And, well, there is a general common factor which works for most athletes, but not for all. This is one of the problems. Well, one thing we know for sure, that sleep is very important. That's and a recovery measure, it always works, you know. Let's speak about low DC potential, which is very common nowadays for whatever reason. So one thing you could look at symptoms. At symptoms and try to cover up, try to get the potential back up kind of artificially. But it's like Cornelius said, you have to look at the cause. Why is it low? Why is HRV is low? Why a high sympathetic tone? There could be another reason. Now you can take a pill if you have a fight with your wife and your sympathetic tone is very high. You could take a pill for that and bring it down, which might be good for a short-term situation, but the long-term you have to solve the conflict. So there's a causal thing, and there's a normal approach to, well, increase recovery in general. So increase the parasympathetic system. Well, the list is almost endless nowadays, we know. Yeah?
Thanks, Henk. You mentioned already the term more, let's say, alternative treatments. Gerrit here obviously has experience, not theoretical experience from both the world of exercise science, but also from medical science, right? But you've also, I've listened to your podcast, for example, where you had an excellent guest on Chinese medicine, which in the West is considered alternative. Based on your experience and also maybe touching upon the not so common cures or strategies to recover a person, what would you say from your point of view?
Well, first off, I have to agree with Kornelius and Henk that it's a lot about the context and where is the athlete coming from that led to that situation. And there's always ways to, again, as Henk said, to stimulate it way up. for example, coffee is a stimulant, and it takes out of other resources of our environment, of our body's environment, to get the sympathetic nervous system going, and this is something that will increase DC potential in very, very short term. What I found, and I've been in the same situation when I started with Omegawave. I asked those same questions. I asked Val, I asked Henk, like, how do I get this up? And I want the fast answer. I want the quick answer. I want that one supplement. Hey Henk, tell me that one supplement. Yeah, give me that one pill. And I was looking for that, and I completely misunderstood what this is about. This is about an organism that's adapting to an environment. And when we look at an organism and environment, we have to look at the environment first, I think. Like, what's the environment this guy is living in, this person is living in? We had one athlete in the ice hockey team, the steep potential completely low for weeks and months. And it took 8-9 months to bring it back up when the environment changed, the pressures changed for that athlete. We had to change things that the press was talking about him with the team, the environment of his training, the environment of his nutrition. And then slowly but steadily, the athlete recovered it in a slow, organic process, which is in the environment. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There's ways to stimulate it up. We can take that simple single pill to manage it, micromanage it in one or the other direction. But the long-term solution is thinking of an organism that's in the environment and see how can this organism completely express and adapt in that environment. And I wish I had the simple answer, but I think the complex answer is way more fascinating.
And interesting.
To keep the trend going, I have to say I agree with Cornelius, Henk, and Gerrit. So no, I think you guys answered exactly how I would answer it. But then one question was an answer. You said, what do you do with low ECG or aerobic MRI? So here we need to understand how to recognize false positives, because there is different reasons why it can be low. So it can be permanent, it can be acute. If it's acute, then the basically decrease in volume of training should do that well. But it can be chronic due to prolonged aerobic activities over a long period of time beyond ability of the person to adapt. And when the electrical axis of the heart changes, so V6 that we derive our data from shift into the back. Now we're not measuring from V6 anymore, but rather it would be like V4 or so, and that's false positive. Regardless of what the number is, the dynamic change in this number will be still accurate representation of behavior of aerobic system. So I wouldn't, if it's chronic low aerobic, it's more likely they probably overdone it. They might be better aerobically than anybody else because they put a huge volume of it, right? But to know exactly what it is, you need to know how to read ECG. And I'm not going to give lesson right now how to read ECG, but I would advise everybody, hey, look at the basic ECG interpretation and then learn how to recognize those false positives.
Quick thing.
Of course.
From a medical perspective, to add just one quick thing, which was really just simple but eye-opening to me to really understand what the ECG component of the Omegawave does is, like when we have a patient come into the medical hospital with a heart attack, we look at the ECG, right? We see there's certain things in the ECG, like between S and T, there's an elevation. And what does it tell us? It tells us something. It's an electrical activity that tells us something about the metabolic thing that's happening there. And that's really the connection. Like if any time we think about, hey, how does that represent anything that's happening in the heart metabolically, ECG doctors use it every day in emergency practice.
Yeah. Can I add something too? Well, okay. Well, the most important thing in recovery is, of course, perfect training. The best way to recover is find a good coach that knows when to step it up, and when to slow down. And this is really the most important thing. There's no pill that can replace, or no intervention that can replace good coaching. And a coach knows what to push his athlete to the edge and then back off at the same time. How many days of rest? How many hours of rest? So that's a neglected factor. Look at your training first, and then we look at other applications when it's not going to work. If you train 3 times a week, then yeah. And you're in the red numbers, you might have been training really, really, really hard. So recovery starts to be a problem when you train multiple times a week, or when the load from the outside life, outside of the sports field, is very stressful with traveling or having a baby or having some other things on your job. That's important too. So don't look immediately at pills or at interventions. Look at the environment first. That's the first thing to do.
We don't, like when a plant in our room does not look good, it's turning brownish. We don't look for the answer really inside the plant to fix the problem. We fix the problem by changing the environment of the plant. That's how an organic system rebuilds itself.
And my last question is, if you went back in your history as a professional in athletic preparation, and we specifically once again talk about regeneration or recovery, what would be the biggest mistake you still see people doing in their approach, in their way they think, and what has been your biggest learning or discovery or revelation in terms of how you approach the whole topic of regeneration?
That's a tough question. It goes really deep.
Yeah.
As an athlete, I had to learn that illness or injuries are the problem of wrong training design on the one side, and on the other side I need the time to adapt to the training. So the right training with the right regeneration methods helps to improve performance. If not, it creates injuries.
Yeah.
So I had to learn that at the age of 16, and I was not good enough or smart enough to understand this at that point.
And you didn't maybe have the coach who
Uh,
did that either?
maybe. The learning system was not good enough.
Yeah.
Okay. And through the work with Omegawave, I realized that I changed my approach from exercise-centered coach to a concept-oriented coach that looks more for the environment, the right exercises, doing the right stuff at the right time, and have the power to stop doing bullshit, and not the anxiety to do, or how should I say it in the right words, have the mental toughness to say, okay, I don't do this because others are doing.
Critical thinking.
Yes.
And being able to synthesize, like the two gentlemen here expressed in their
and it takes
presentation.
And I think this is it's merely the toughest. I think it's the toughest point in training design to stop and to say it's enough.
Have the courage to say
do nothing.
Yes.
To have the confidence to say do nothing.
Yeah.
And to get to this point, I think this really, you need technology and you need concept knowledge and experience. Yeah. And it's a long path to go.
Have that maturity in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
I think this is my story a little bit.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. Thank you. What about Henk? You have decades of experience.
I don't know if it tells you anything, because there's people with decades of experience. The thing is, do you learn from that experience or not? This is the big question. The field of sports is, let me say, complicated. I have a complex relationship with sports. I think there's so many mistakes, and the problem is people don't seem to learn from it. Like Val said in his presentation, most coaches work by guesswork. Now, I'm a good guesser and I was very lucky, so that was good. But the Omegawave technology takes out the guesswork. So it refines, it leaves less chance for experimentation, because now you know why an athlete doesn't perform well, because now you can measure in the days before he's in the red number. So now you start to realize that you're doing something wrong in your periodization, in your planning. And before, you simply blame the athlete. Now you can blame yourself. The biggest mistake is that still we are as coaches, we are still driven by anxiety. So we think we don't do enough. We didn't give it all we got. We didn't do the extra mile. It's the extra mile that kills you. Exactly. Now that's one of the big mistakes. And my observation is that it doesn't change very much over years. In 20 years, you still see the same mistakes, the same concept. The more, the better. And that's a famous expression is, train as much as necessary, not as much as possible. It still applies, but too many people agree with it and too few people really follow up on that. They still try to push as hard as possible, and without having the technology to see the red number showing up. Others that should be, well, there's still people driving through the red light as well.
For me, probably the biggest change was a change that was in parts inspired by people like Val and Henk, and it's this. I grew up in sports science and in medicine. I grew up with a mechanistic worldview. Like René Descartes already painted the body as a machine, but there's an important difference between machines and organisms. And in a machine, when you have a certain input, you get a certain output, and that's reproducible. In an organism, the same input can lead to different outputs, and that's something I encountered in training. That's all of us have encountered that in training. And the important part that's in between in an organism is the adaptive reservoir. And the machine doesn't have that. And I see the same thing in medicine. A lot of the chronic diseases we have nowadays, they are adaptive diseases. They're diseases of non-adaptation or misadaptation. And by looking at it from a linear perspective, like a machine, mechanistically, we're not going to solve those. We can solve those by looking at organically and accepting the fact that there's an organic reservoir lurking somewhere in the athlete. And if that's respected, we can think about the environment and how the athlete can, or the patient can adapt and handle disease and also handle training loads. And that was looking at it with that biological lens instead of the sports science or mechanistic lens, that changed my world.
This is a good example of a broken telephone game. Question was one, but we had like 3 different answers that are not related. So I'll go to original question, and I will talk about the other side of the coin that you answered. So typical problem that I observed in our users, and it is a problem for us. When they see red data, they immediately stop athletes from doing activities, don't train. And that's not exactly what we are teaching. I had personally multiple athletes who came to me and said, hey, you know what, I'm working with your practitioner and it's been now a month and I can't do anything but very low walking on treadmill. And this is professional players. And they look, and I say, okay, fine. And nothing changes. So I'm still in red. And to understand the concept, actually, this is the time maybe when you have to work more than usual to get people out of it. So I would put them, but it has to be proper work that will produce very particular adaptations. And then I could fix it within a couple weeks by working them. They said, we work harder than we ever did. And we change all of that through hard work. And they feel happy because they still can perform work, right? And they feel happy because first time in the month, after being told that they can't do anything, they start seeing changes, positive changes. So that can be quite a positive learning about our approach. So if you look from medical standpoint, same thing. When you are green, you don't need to do much. When you are red, you have to do a lot, right? So why do we think it's different? Organism is an organism. Why do we think it's different in our case? So, but of course, the key is, if you're not sure what you are doing, you're safer to stay back. So it only applies if you have a very clear picture of what needs to be done to fix those components.
Can I add one thing? Yeah, I mean, to add to that, when we look at this adaptive reservoir, time is only one resource this reservoir needs, right? So only taking the time off, just like after an injury, 6 weeks just doing nothing is only one part of healing an injury. Like the adaptive system needs more resources, foods, supplementations, maybe some more specific training methodologies might be the correct resource to get the athlete back up.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, just coming this idea coming from well, basically you would say the coaches train too hard and too much, while the physical therapist trains too little and too easy, as a matter of fact. So that could be, well, summing up the idea. That's, yeah.
But to conclude once again, red windows of trainability does not mean that passive rest is the only way to do. It can be, but it's not automatic.
So you also have to know You also have to know how to recognize our data and separate medical occurrence from just physical fatigue. If it's medical occurrence, it does mean stop. So if somebody has pre-cardiac event based on ECG analysis, I would say don't work hard. But if it's just the effect of improper training, then yes, actually we have to work hard to fix it. So there is never a simple answer, right? No. It's not black and white, yes. So depends.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, gentlemen, for your excellent insights, and I wish you an excellent second day here at the Athletik-Konferenz. Thank you.